Hi, I'm Tommy Bass with Montana State University Extension, and I'm joined here today with my colleague from the Montana Department of Agriculture, Andrea SARCHET. We're going to present our Montana perspective on safely utilizing animal manure and manure composts on small produce farms. We want everyone to take away today that the rules and best practices don't have to be overwhelming, and produce farms can safely benefit from using manure and compost. What are our manure sources here in Montana? Well, we're primarily a cow-calf state, though we do have some backgrounding in cattle finishing. We probably have about 40 or 50 large hog operations. And those small feedlots and backgrounding lots and the hog operations really represent the only manure in the state that can be collected, processed, composted, treated, etc. And all of our counties have sufficient conventional crop ground relative to the manure nutrients that are produced to agronomically assimilate those nutrients. Now, there can be some pockets of high nutrient concentration within a county or around certain operations, but this is usually easily remedied with nearby export and nutrient management planning. So where are our nutrients going right now? Well, manure and manure products are primarily going to conventional crop and forage ground. Somewhere second or third in there, it's going to reclamation projects, and that could be mine cleanup, construction and erosion and sediment control. We're also sending some of these nutrients to acreages and organic cereal grains, and Montana is a leader in those products nationally. And our sod farms and nurseries and greenhouses are also using manure-based nutrients for their enterprises. But the emerging opportunity and market for manure-based nutrients is our small produce farms and market gardens. And really about 8 years ago, I started getting more inquiries into my extension office from entrepreneurial vegetable and specialty crop producers looking to acquire manure and looking for advice on how to use manure and manure products. They're asking about renovating new acreage, new leases, new purchases, new farms. So wanting to improve their soils first and foremost. And then they were seeking information on how to use manure and manure products for their ongoing fertility. And in these images, we see some MSU students at our organic produce teaching farm applying and spreading a manure-based compost in a high tunnel greenhouse, and then incorporating that with a rototiller. And these hoop houses and high tunnels are pretty important for us. You see in the first picture that it's sunny and dry. And then in the second picture on the rototiller day, well, a spring snowstorm has come through and you see the piles of snow outside. There seem to be some perceived barriers in connecting the animal ag sector with these specialty crop producers. And that means that we're having missed market opportunities for moving these manure and manure products between the sectors. And that just is going to have to be answered by Extension and Department of Ag and the producer associations through facilitation and education. And what those barriers may be about is the fear and misunderstanding around rules and regulations. So concern over food safety and accidentally bringing in pathogens from the animal sector into the produce sector. Concerns over herbicide residues in compost or the manure itself, residues that have passed through the animals perhaps. And then concern over what the implications would be for those producers pursuing organic certification. And I want to real quick go over a case study of a farm that is incorporating all of these concepts that we're talking about here today. And Amalthea Organic Dairy is a small diversified farm and cheese plant. They have a dairy goat enterprise, a pastured pig enterprise, as well as an organic vegetable enterprise. And all of those production areas, of course, produce organic residuals that can be used for their on-site compost manufacture. And they make that compost first and foremost to fertilize their feed crops. So some significant acreage and feed crop for the goats, for their vegetable enterprise. And then when there are surplus nutrients and compost available, they have occasional bulk and bagged compost sales. But basically they are moving these animal-based nutrients through all of their plant and animal enterprises in a closed loop. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Andrea now.
All right, so I just want to go through talk through some key produce safety and organic standards for manure and compost use. I'll start by giving a very brief overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the specific regulatory requirements, and then also talk through best practices and how that overlaps with the USDA gaps. With the regulatory requirements, you may hear me use the word must in relation to the regulatory language of the produce safety rule, and you'll see section symbols so that you can reference that later. And then with the best practices, I may use the word should to kind of differentiate those two things. And then we'll just talk more broadly about the implications for produce growers. So what is the Food Safety Modernization Act? FSMA, of course, marks a really big change to our nation's food supply, and it encompasses the entire food system. So there are 7 rules of FSMA, and the produce safety rule is just one of those rules that we're going to focus in on today. Focuses on prevention of food safety issues, and all the rules of FSMA are science and risk-based. So it's important to know who is affected by FSMA, who's going to be required to comply with the rules of FSMA and the produce safety rule. We're talking about produce growers, but specifically anyone who grows, harvests, packs, or holds produce. So that is really key there, and I want to talk through briefly what the different statuses are in regard to the produce safety rule. So you may be exempt from the produce safety rule if on average your produce sales are less than $25,000 per year. And that means you don't have to comply with the rule at all. There will be no inspections or any other requirements there. Someone who is qualified exempt is a person a farm that has less than a total of $500,000 in produce sales. And in addition to that, most of those sales are local. So that is going to be the majority, or more than 50%, must be within the same state or 275 miles of the farm. And if you don't fit into either of those two categories, you may be covered by or subject to the produce safety rule and have to comply with all those requirements. So other folks that are possibly having to comply with the rule are wholesale food establishments and importers of produce. It does not, however, apply to retail food operations. And there I have that video in the lower right-hand corner there. We have a link to that at the end. That goes over in much more detail. It's about a 7-minute video, but it really helps people understand if that rule is going to apply to them. All right, so specific regulations on those soil amendments. First, we have to really define treated versus untreated soil amendments. A treated soil amendment is going to require a controlled process such as composting or heat treatment that will fully decompose that organic matter and reduce pathogens. Temperature is going to be the primary method of pathogen reduction, although chemical and biological factors contribute to that reduction as well. So only a treatment process that's been scientifically validated will ensure pathogen reduction. We'll talk more about that a little bit more later. So process monitoring and record keeping are also going to be critical there. So for those untreated soil amendments, there is no minimum application interval for treated soil. So you can apply those all the way up until the day of harvest. However, for untreated soil amendments, we're talking about amendments that are considered higher risk since they have not been treated to reduce those pathogens. Some examples of untreated amendments might be raw manure, aged or stacked manure, agricultural teas, and then of course any soil amendment that has been mixed with manure or an untreated soil amendment. So the reason that, as Tommy kind of mentioned too, the reason that those manures present a food safety risk is because they can spread and carry human pathogens. And then as far as the untreated application interval goes, the FDA has not specified an application interval yet, so the recommendation is to follow NOP standards, and that is 120 days for crops that do contact the soil and 90 days for crops that do not contact the soil. Okay, so as far as handling and storage goes on the rule requirements, so the musts would be covered farms have to handle, convey, and store soil amendments so that they don't become a potential source of contamination. They must not contaminate produce, food contact surfaces, water sources, or any other soil amendments. As far as some shoulds, best practices go, designating specific equipment and tools for handling those soil amendments. You can use paint marking, for example, on your tools to make sure that you're only using those on those untreated soil amendments. Developing SOPs for cleaning and sanitizing equipment and tools, and also being thoughtful of where the traffic is going, directing your foot traffic and equipment traffic around those soil amendments to reduce that risk of cross-contamination is really helpful. Be thinking about runoff, leaching, and wind drift, and then keeping manure and finished compost in separate areas so they don't cross-contaminate. On the record keeping side of things, if you're doing on-farm composting, the requirements are to establish and keep records that document those process controls. So more specifically talking about that, we're looking at a scientifically validated process, which really documents the times, temperatures, and turnings that you're using to make sure that would comply. And then if you are purchasing any treated biological soil amendments, you must keep on hand that documentation that talks about what process controls they used and that's sufficient for that. Best practices, you can also look at the type and source of the soil amendment, rates and dates of application. Those are good things to do as well, not necessarily required by the produce safety rule. All right, so as far as the overlap between GAPs, USDA GAPs and and the produce safety rule. So these are more best practices. GAP standards are very similar in terms of handling and storage and record keeping. But as far as selection goes, GAP standards going above and beyond that would be to just stay away from those untreated soil amendments. That certainly would reduce your risk. Look at the application timing in terms of you can extend it beyond those NOP standards that we talked about. And then application methods, just making sure you're not putting any adjacent crops at risk as well. So getting into the organic side of things, we have an organic system plan example form here that kind of leads you through a bit of a flow chart to figure out what your risks are and how to manage those. So this is just an example of that. And more specifically, in a couple areas for organic certifications, you really need to be thoughtful of be looking on the organic approved products list to see if you are currently using any prohibited materials or soil amendments. And then you have to go 3 years without using those in order to transition over to organic and start your certification process. As far as ongoing use, we already talked about that 90-120 day rule. So that applies all the time for same thing as far as untreated and treated soil amendments, manure versus those other treated ones. And then ag chemical residues, there's a number of things. While the NOP standard doesn't specifically address ag chemical residues, producers can take a number of measures to be sure that they really won't have an issue there in terms of getting those letters of certification and analysis from anyone you're purchasing those amendments from as well.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea. So in summary, manure and compost are valuable nutrient inputs for small produce farms. The food safety risks associated with using manure can be minimized with proper management, whether complying fully with the FSMA related produce rules or following the recommended good agricultural practices. It's also important to remember manure and compost products are not generally prohibited. The best practices and application interval rules and whatnot should be followed, but using the GAPs, following the rules will allow you to bring manure and compost onto a produce operation. Here are the contacts for myself and Andrea, both phone and email, and a copy of the link that was referenced in slide 11, the Am I Covered by FSMA 7-minute video. With that, we thank you for your time, and we look forward to the live question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thanks.